Hello, and welcome to the official podcast of the Cleveland International Film Festival, CIFF Speaks, sponsored by Wayside Furniture. I'm Dee Perry, and I'm joined by my co-host and producer, Aaron Spears.
Hey, Dee, this festival has a number of competitions and awards that honor filmmakers who tell powerful stories in innovative ways, and one of the more recent of those awards is the Dreammaker Award.
Right, Aaron. It was created in 2019 following the passing of a beloved CIFF trustee, David K. Ream. It was designed to celebrate an LGBTQIA+ filmmaker whose body of work explores and amplifies the conversations around gender and identity.
And joining us now is the filmmaker who is this year's recipient of the Dreammaker Award and the director of Framing Agnes, the film we will be discussing today, Chase Joynt. Welcome to CIFF Speaks.
Thanks for having me.
Congratulations on your award. It's really well-deserved.
Oh, I'm very honored.
I want to start by sharing who the Agnes of your film title was and how you first became aware of her story.
So Agnes is a young trans woman who approached the UCLA Gender Clinic in the late 1950s seeking access to surgery. And one of the reasons why she is remembered to this day is because she lied to doctors about her history in order to gain access to these life-affirming procedures. And I first came to know about Agnes through my journeys in academia. One of the interesting things about her case is that a variety of different disciplines have attached to her story for different reasons. So we have a sociological interpretation, we have a psychological interpretation, we have a gender studies interpretation. And when you think about that, the fact that the same kind of archival source material can be reinterpreted by different people for different outcomes, it's an electric time to think, what role do archives play? What role does research play in the shaping of our various histories?
Well, and Chase, also the words that we hear in your film from Agnes and also the other subjects in the film came from transcripts prepared, as you were mentioning, from UCLA's Gender Identity Research Clinic and a sociologist there. Could you explain a little bit like who the researcher was and then also how you came across those files to begin with?
Yeah, absolutely. So the transcripts that we're pulling from are from the archive of Harold Garfinkel, who at the time of these interviews was a young, untenured sociologist who had elbowed his way onto a multidisciplinary research team of people who were broadly exploring problems of sex and gender. And I think one of the things that's really important to consider is the time frame in which this research was being done. So we're in the mid-century. We're at a time where people are literally developing the categories of identification that we all now inhabit or resist. And so what we are seeing, what we have access to is an exploratory process where Garfinkel is casting his understanding of difference across his case study. So he's finding a piece of information from one person and taking it into the next meeting and saying, well, I'm talking to another person who says this. What do you think about that? And so it's this very unstable ground in which we can watch how meaning is being produced. And to make a very long story short, my very good friend and collaborator of 20 years, Kristen Schultz, and I have been obsessed with the case study of Agnes for the better part of a decade and managed to get into Garfinkel's archive. And as we explore in the film, literally found her case files alongside the case files of 8 other gender nonconforming people in the bottom of a rusted filing cabinet.
That's a Geraldo Rivera story.
Indeed.
Except you actually found something worthwhile. I've read reactions, Chase, from 1960s participants in that UCLA gender research series of interviews, and they now describe their interviews as feeling harmful. So I was curious how you and Kristen felt about the tone and direction of the questions from Professor Garfinkel.
Yeah, it's a great question. I love that that's where you're going with this material, because I think one of the things that our film is doing is thinking about the legacy of the question and the violence of the question. And so one of the things that grounds the methodological approach to the film is that immediately upon reading these transcripts, I was struck by the relationship between the questions that researchers were asking trans and gender nonconforming people and the similarities to the ways in which talk show hosts were asking questions of people on those stages in the 1980s through to the present day. And so for me, it was a really interesting thought experiment to imagine what would happen if we collapsed these contexts. What if we thought about medicine and media together as vehicles through which we come to know about trans and gender nonconforming people?
I'm fascinated. I love this film, and I'm fascinated by how you built these different layers within your narrative. It is a documentary, but you have these recreations. And so you've got historical biography going on. You've got these recreations going on. I think it's just a fantastic evolution in the way you've been making documentaries. How did you put together and create the different layers of narrative? I don't know if I'm asking the question properly. Do you, like your recreations, you have talking head interviews, like it's fantastic. But like, how did you build that out?
It's great. And Aaron, I'll reflect back to you that I was having a conversation with someone recently, and they said, I tried over a dinner table to summarize what your film does. Right. And I found it to be a very difficult process of engagement. So you're not alone. I think at its base value, I don't believe in a kind of historical or archival truth. I think that we are always encountering people who are performing themselves for various different ends. So when we find these transcripts from the UCLA Gender Clinic in the late 1950s, we don't find the truth of a group of people who were in that time and place. We find the strategies of people who were trying to negotiate a system that was quite literally designed to exclude them. And so already there's a level of performance. Yeah. And so why don't we actually think about that? Not as a mode of deception, but as a mode of life making and survival, and embolden our participants to think about that with us on screen. And so one of the things that I say about Agnes is it's the most deeply collaborative project of my life and my career, precisely because what arrives on screen is co-created with those who are imagining themselves and their words and their communities within this archival material. So even though it's a verbatim, people are obsessed with verbatim, even though it's a verbatim recitation of words that we found in an archive, what happens when they are delivered through the body and mind and experience of someone else? Is that true? Or is that some kind of like hybrid space where someone is saying, this is me and not me simultaneously? And so really investing in that, to return to your question, requires that we explore that material from a variety of different vantage points. It really requires that we're both on screen and off screen, that we're thinking about the role of technology and how the actual language of cinema and recording is what teaches us how to encounter people. So from the alienation of a kind of black and white talk show set up to the kind of intimacy of a Super 8 recording.
Yeah. And to be clear, it's not a confusing movie when you're watching it at all.
Thank you.
Wildly entertaining and often like really funny too. But yeah, trying to summarize it real quickly, I'd be like, just watch it.
Yeah, totally.
Right. And again, the transcripts that the conversations are based on came from conversations with gender nonconforming individuals who spoke with Professor Garfinkel, and then you chose a cast of all trans actors to play those roles, but also talk about themselves. I was wondering as I was watching what the casting process was. Did you call on people you knew? Did you have an open call? Was there some other method?
That's a great question. So we definitely asked people who were in our networks and circuits and asked them strategically based on the kind of resonances between those that we found in the archive and those that we knew in our world. So what does it mean that we're able to reach out to Max Wolf Valerio, an extraordinarily important transmasculine poet who came up in San Francisco in the 1970s, and ask him to walk toward the narrative of someone like Henry, who was writing about his life 20 years prior? Those kinds of resonances you can't make up. So casting is definitely one way, but are we actually casting, or are we trying to do something else entirely that might not really have a name? And the other thing that I will say is that all of our talent, all of our actors, all of our participants, whatever label you want to give them, are people who were, prior to our project, oriented toward a public life. So every single one of our people is already thinking about publicness, is already thinking about iconicity, is already thinking about performance. And so it allowed us to step toward really complicated questions about what does it mean to be pulled out from a pack and be made a kind of exemplary subject, which at its most meta level is also what happened to Agnes.
I'm always fascinated with documentarians, filmmakers in general, but I think documentary is such a specific type of film. You made a short version of Framing Agnes, 2019. At what point was it where you're like, nope, nope, this is a feature? Like when you finally call, this is done, and I put the documentary out. I always find that fascinating. So it seems like it would be done because you did this short, but like, what was it that drew you back? You're like, nope, there's more here. I want to keep going with this.
Yeah, so the very simple answer to your question is money.
Oh, okay.
It's so hard to make movies. It's so
Yeah.
hard to make movies. And it's so hard to make movies about minoritized subjects and histories because it doesn't immediately arrive those who know less about it to dollar signs in their eyes and large scale streaming audiences. And so I think that one of the things that was so exciting about the short for us is we made it on credit cards and a little bit of grant money and favors of friends, and we shot it in 3 days in a single room. And you can, if you watch closely, see all of that on screen. And so, but it was a way for us to test drive the method.
Oh, sure.
And to our earlier conversation about how do you summarize this film, one of the greatest ways to summarize it is, as you said, Aaron, go watch it. Because the minute it clicks in, people are like, I see those moves. I see what you're doing. And so we were able to say with a 19-minute short, here's what it could feel like. Here's what's possible, and we need more money. And so it allowed us to fundraise. It allowed us to welcome Jen Richards and Stephen Ira into the cast. The short only reckons with 4 of the cases. And then the other way that I will answer your question that I think is interesting and notable as we're having this conversation in 2022 is that we made the short with the same archival material. However, we made it at a very different time. So what emerges in the short film is a connection between historical and contemporary subjects that's really rooted in an investment in personal narrative. We spend a lot more time in I grew up in this place, I had these feelings, I had these experiences. And when we arrived to shoot the feature a couple of years later, all of us collectively felt really tired of those kinds of storytelling strategies and instead turned those connections toward like broader socio-political contexts, which I think is, emblematic of the ways in which dialogue about trans representation has changed in the last few years.
Well, it's a unique approach too, I think, just from the way you're describing it, where you're like, you got to do a first draft and then you got to make it better.
Yes.
Yeah. Not dismissing the short at all, but yeah.
You don't even have to worry about that. You're absolutely right. And I think this is the problem with, indie hustle filmmaking is that so often we don't get a chance to refine. We don't get a chance to take a break and say, what else could we do if we had a little bit more resources? Right. And I don't think you always need money to make something extraordinary. Like, I think it's based on the people you're collaborating with, but that time and space was hugely important for our process.
Yeah, because you mentioned money, but you're also saying that you specifically were mentioning the creative process. Like you had time and you had thought, and you also grew. Everybody grew a few years.
Definitely.
I think part of that growth was one of your previous documentaries, No Ordinary Man, which was co-directed with Aisling Chin Yi. It played at CIFF and won the top documentary prize. And Framing Agnes is your debut as a solo director on a feature-length film. So I was triply impressed with both the structure, the content, and your multiple roles, directing and starring. What degree of difficulty was it for you doing both at the same time on a feature?
Well, we could say that Framing Agnes was about a number of different things. One of those things has to be authorship. I think, if anything, it's a kind of reckoning with authority. And so just as I'm asking our participants to step toward this multiplicity of performance, they are both themselves and someone else simultaneously, so too did I have to walk toward the complexity of my role in the project's making. If we're thinking about the violence and power of the question, what does it mean that I am the person who is driving this machine forward and asking all of these questions? And so how do I make visible these kinds of mechanisms of power that exist within our documentary? As much as I have a kind of utopian fantasy that we've democratized the power and we are here together and we are a collective breathing body, it's not true. Like, ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm the person who's in the edit. I'm the person who's making these decisions. And so how do we think about the complexity of that together on screen? And so it required me to be the face that you see in that reverse shot. And I don't think it would be incorrect if you found my presence to be irritating or annoying throughout that film, because It might just be because you don't like me as a performer, but it also might be because you're having to reckon with the machine. You're having to like think about the structure of the interview and all of the power play that exists within those dynamics and engagements.
Yeah, what you just said made me re-see parts of the film, because I did find your narrator irritating, but I knew it was because of the source material that you were asking those questions. But it was lost on me until just now that in the parts where the actors are themselves, you are also yourself sitting on a couch next to them instead of across and being an adversary. So that nice meta.
Yeah, well, and it's also just to think with you, part of my investment in recording technologies, from the Super 8 to the talk show to the 35 to the archival, is to think about them as portals to both intimacy and alienation, right? How do we get close? How do we feel repelled from? And what is the technology actually doing to instruct us in those ways?
Yeah.
Jason, I wanted to ask, as you have been putting Framing Agnes out to the film world. On paper, it looks like you lived the filmmaker's dream at Sundance this year, obviously with the exception of you weren't able to be there. No one was able to be there in person. Although I liked it as a Clevelander, I was able to attend Sundance for a couple of years because I didn't have to leave my house. But with Framing Agnes won the next audience award, and the Innovator Award, sorry. Could you speak to your Sundance experience? And do you think this is going to help you out with some of that funding with future projects?
Let's hope, right? I mean, I feel we are incredibly grateful for the run at Sundance. It is true that it's a kind of filmmaker's dream to arrive there with a project and then to come out on the other side with multiple awards is otherworldly. But one of the things that I think is so meaningful and enduring about that experience is the fact that we really made this film on our own terms. We made this film having been rejected by so many granting agencies who didn't understand what we were doing and who didn't want to take a chance on something so deeply trans, both in its subject matter, but in its methodology, and so experimental. And it felt really exciting to be welcomed and to be met by an audience. To your point about the sort of interesting glories of being online, is that I know that that audience award came from the fact that there were many people who otherwise would not have been able to see our film. That is why we won the audience award. I have no fantasy that it's because we had the ABC critic from ABC Mag in our audience, auditorium in Park City. It's because our world was in their living rooms watching our film and talking about it online and moving it around the world in a different way. And for that, I'm extraordinarily grateful. And I am very excited to see how we can leverage and sort of kick that door open for lots of people who are making this kind of work.
Excellent.
And your approach to making this kind of work is unique for sure. But I'm wondering if you can point to other filmmakers or just other creative people in general who've inspired you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, there's two different ways that I'll approach that question. One of which is that I feel like I really cut my teeth learning about and studying AIDS activist cinema makers, those who were making work in the peak of the AIDS crisis, who, really identified as making cinemas of urgency, things that needed to be made in that moment by those people for very particular socio-political reasons. And I link that kind of work to, Black queer experimentalists. So people like Marlon Riggs, people like Cheryl Dunye, people who are always slipping on the borderlines of genre. And I think that for those of us who have existed outside the mechanisms of power, and what I mean by that is representational power as well, those of us who are always represented and not representing, you have to find that borderline of genre in order to tell stories that push back against, various agendas which seek to absorb and consume you. And so there are many, if we had a whole nother podcast, I could just spend all the time talking about the citational references, because I do feel like Framing Agnes is a deeply citational work. It is always trying to make visible the fact that it is not new what we are doing, that in fact, we are borrowing from those who have been doing it for decades.
Very cool.
I'm so glad to hear you say Cheryl Dunye, because when I was trying to do that film geek like equation of like, okay, Framing Agnes has got this and this and this. What other documentaries are like? And I kept going back to The Watermelon Woman because it had that
Yes,
multiple aesthetics and approach. Oh yeah, so sweet. I was stuck in
love it.
documentary mode for too long there, but yeah.
Yeah, well, precisely. I love that you went there. I love that you went there. Thank you.
So we wanted to ask, taking home this award from the Cleveland International Film Festival is more than just an award. It's also fulfilling a different mission of community engagement and outreach. So could you let us know some of your plans or what you're really looking forward to as part of that outreach while you're in Cleveland?
Oh, what an extraordinary gift to be able to come and network and be in conversation with those in the local Cleveland community. I will say, on the tails of your asking the question about Sundance, that is one form of glorious engagement that can come. But our team is really deeply rooted in the on-the-ground DIY activist and community networks. And we all differently identify as having come up through those roots. And so to be able to talk about the film and to talk about queer and trans rights more broadly with those who are living and working and thriving feels like the most important work. And I am excited that the film is one of the ways in which we can gain access to those spaces and conversations.
So cool. I've got to say, I hardly ever use the word thrilling to describe a documentary, but yours was for so many reasons. And I'm so happy that we got a chance to talk with you about it.
Thank you so much. I've loved this conversation.
We've been talking with director and Dreammaker Award winner Chase Joynt about his film Framing Agnes. That film will be screened on Friday, April 8th at 5 p.m. and Saturday, April 9th at 2:30 p.m. at Playhouse Square's KeyBank State Theater. It's also part of CIFF 46 Streams, which will run online April 10th through the 17th. You can get more information about the festival when you log on to clevelandfilm.org. I'm Dee Perry.
And I'm Aaron Spears.
Thanking our sponsor for this podcast, Wayside Furniture, keeping it local since 1937. And many thanks to you for listening to CIFF Speaks.